Hello, scholars. This is Mr. Myers. We're going to do lesson 4.2 on voting. As always, please take good structured notes over the objectives. We're going to start by looking at some historical milestones associated with suffrage rights. We'll talk a little bit about turnout levels at elections and what can impact that. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about voter registration requirements. Okay, let's start by looking at a quick historical overview of milestones in voting. When the country was founded, the right of suffrage was limited largely to property owning males, and in some cases, even property owning males who belonged to the church. Over time, and by 1820 or 1830 or so, universal white manhood suffrage had spread to every state. So all white men could vote, but women and non whites were largely excluded. So at the end of the Civil War, the first major milestone in expanding suffrage rights was the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment banned voting discrimination based on race, but not by sex. And so basically what this did is it gave the franchise to former enslaved men. However, many states adopted other race related discriminatory laws to try to undermine that. And so there were a whole host of things from grandfather clauses, which said that if your grandfather was a slave, you can't vote, literacy tests proving that you have to be able to read and write, poll taxes, which basically means you have to pay money in order to vote. All of those things were barriers. Of course, also fear and violence and intimidation were also barriers to African American men exercising the franchise. The next major milestone after a century or more of agitation was women's suffrage, and that came in the form of the 19th Amendment, which was finally ratified in 1920. So if we fast forward a little bit, our next major kind of phase of agitation comes during the Civil Rights Movement in the Vietnam era. Here we have the 24th Amendment being passed, which banned voter discrimination based on the ability to pay a poll tax. It is, I forgot to mention, also important to remember that sometimes poor whites were also banned or negatively impacted from voting with poll taxes and literacy tests. It wasn't necessarily only discriminatory towards African Americans, but that barrier was eliminated with the 24th Amendment. The Voting Rights Act banned literacy tests and any law that would result in discrimination by race or language in 1965. This was a landmark piece of legislation. Basically means that that states that historically struggled with discrimination, which is largely the states in the former Confederacy, would have to get clearance through the federal government for any laws that potentially would make it more difficult for anyone to vote. Relatively recently, the Supreme Court has not gutted, but struck down parts of the Voting Rights Act. Parts of it are still in place. And then the 26th Amendment banned voting discrimination for age. That's important because during the Vietnam War, young men were going to fight and die. Yet they couldn't vote for the politicians that were sending them to war. So a major movement here is to allow 18-year-olds who are eligible for military service to be able to have a say in the leaders who might send them to war. On the right, you see a missing poster for three Mississippi voter registration workers who were brutally murdered in the 1960s. And I just want to make sure that I point out that people literally died, were murdered, gave their lives for the right to be able to vote. It's something that Americans take very, very seriously, and we need to remember the sacrifices that were made to ensure that all of us have equal access at the ballot. Now, despite all those sacrifices that were made in order to get voting equity, we still have relatively low voter turnout. The United States has one of the lower voter turnout rates of any industrialized nation in the world. The highest election rates would be during presidential elections, when about 50 to 60% of eligible voters would turn out. You can see in the graphic on the right that this last election in 2020 was one of the higher turnouts in the last 100 years. Highest ever in American history, I think, was in 1840 when William Henry Harrison won the election, and about 80% of eligible voters came out to the polls. Those numbers go down when we're talking about congressional elections, sometimes referred to as midterms. This is when there's not a presidential election, so every other 2 years. And rates go down anywhere from 35 to 45% on those. And local elections, even smaller, about 10 to 20% turnout. And that's for your school board members, your mayor, your city council members. And that's somewhat ironic because most of the interactions that people have with their government are at the local level. It's with their local police, it's with their local school board, it's with local city ordinances, and so on and so forth. So, what are the factors then that can help explain high or low voter turnout? Well, one of them would be the registration system itself. If you look on the right, there's a list of reasons why people didn't vote in the last 2020 presidential election. Some of those are personal reasons, like they didn't care or they, didn't know enough about the candidates or whatever the case might be. But some of them are structural. They relate to they didn't have an ID or the polling hours weren't conducive to their work schedule, or the polling locations were too far away, or they couldn't get a ride and didn't have access to the mail-in ballots ahead of time, or whatever the case might be. So part of it is about the structural registration system itself. Another aspect that can help to determine voter turnout is how competitive the races are. If the races are not very competitive, if the districts are super gerrymandered, and it's almost a foregone conclusion that the Republican candidate or the Democratic candidate is going to win, people don't show up if they don't think their vote's going to matter. Another factor is obviously the type of election. In the last slide, we talked about, presidential elections have the highest turnout, local elections have the lower turnout. Another thing to consider is sometimes people can put something on a ballot like recreational marijuana in Missouri. That actually drove up voter turnout because people who cared just about smoking weed wanted to show up and cast their vote for that. And then, of course, they cast votes up and down the ballot and on the other races as well. So sometimes having a popular ballot initiative can also increase voter turnout. We also have some demographic related issues that help to explain turnout. Older people tend to vote at higher rates, wealthier people, more educated people tend to vote at higher rates, and women as well. In the last couple election cycles, you've started to see young people vote at higher rates than before. Part of that might be, fears of global warming. It could be frustration with overturning of Roe v. Wade. But we have seen an uptick in young people, which historically are one of the demographics that do not show up very reliably at the polls. So scholars, now I need to make sure you are armed with all the information that you need in order to be able to exercise your right to vote. So in Missouri, in order to register, you have to be 17 and a half years old and 18 by the time of the actual election. So you can register when you're 17 and a half. You have to have proof of identity. Must be a U.S. citizen. That's true of every state in the union. Can't be on parole or probation due to a felony conviction, not currently in prison, and not ever having convicted a felony related to voting. So if you committed armed robbery and were convicted on that felony charge but served your time, you would be able to vote in Missouri. In terms of participation at the polls, you need the proper form of identification, and the polls are open from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. And as long as you are in line by 7 p.m., even if it takes hours to actually get to the actual booth where you can vote, you're safe. You just have to be in line by 7 p.m. And I hope I don't need to say this, but I'm going to go ahead and say this anyway. But I would argue that this is probably one of the single most important duties of citizens. We talked about that in 4.1. Exercising the franchise, it's super important that we have an educated citizenry who understands the issues and goes out there and exercises their right to vote. For more specifics on how to register and other information related to polling in Missouri, just go to the Secretary of State's webpage, and there's all kinds of information there for you. Hope you took good notes. Please bring any questions to class.